Welcome to this virtual event. I'm Dr. Michelle Dion, Associate Professor of Political Science and Academic Director of CRESS, the Center for Research in Empirical Social Sciences at McMaster University. I want to begin by acknowledging that McMaster is on the unceded territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I personally am participating from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I'm very excited to be able to welcome today our guests all the way from New Zealand, where it's very early in the morning. We have two of the co-authors of a paper that is up on First View and will be forthcoming in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. I'm going to put the link to the paper in the chat so that you can access that if you would like. The title of the paper is Consent Requires a Relationship, Rethinking Group Consent and Its Timing in Ethnographic Research. Dr. Carisa Showden is a currently senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and formerly associate professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She's the author of Choices Women Make, Agency and Domestic Violence, Assisted Reproduction and Sex Work from Minnesota University Press, and co-author of Youth Who Trade Sex in the U.S., Intersectionality, Agency, Vulnerability from Temple University Press, among other works. We also have with us Karen Nairn, who is at the University of Otago and currently based in Dunedin.
Dunedin.
How do you say it?
Dunedin.
Dunedin. Aotearoa, which I believe is the Maori way to say New Zealand. And she draws on her geography and education background to engage in interdisciplinary research with young people. This activism project builds on earlier research with young people who grew up during New Zealand's economic reforms and explored their post-high school paths in the book Children of Rogernomics, A Neoliberal Generation Leaves School. So I will now hand it over to Karen and Carisa. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Michelle. We're really pleased and excited to be able to talk with other folks about how you're thinking about working ethically with groups in various research projects, and to talk to you about some of the challenges and opportunities and sort of learnings that we've taken from this project that we're still working in. It's a 3-year project. We are at the, where are we now, Karen? Year 2.5, is that fair? Yes, okay. So I know that some of you have already read the article, so I don't want to go over it in great detail. I just thought I would highlight a few key ideas from it to sort of frame our conversation, but also in the context of doing that, talk a little bit about our conversations among ourselves as a research team and sort of what led us to think about writing this article and some of the challenges that we faced in doing the research, but also that we're continuing to face. I don't want to say challenges, but sort of opportunities for growth and learning that we have with as we're starting to write out of the project. And as I mentioned before we started recording, it is a bit early for me. I'm not a morning person, so I have prepared some notes. I apologize for reading a bit. Otherwise, I will free associate at this hour. It's just I don't have enough coffee to not do so. So that could get interesting, but maybe not exactly what we were going for today. So a little bit of context for the article that led Michelle to extend this great invitation. And it's from our project, Putting Hope into Action, where we are a team of 5 researchers spread throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand. Three researchers are in Dunedin, one's in Wellington, and then I'm based in Auckland. But we're working with 6 groups across the country. Some of them are based in Auckland, others are based in Wellington, although many of them have chapters throughout the country. So I mentioned that to say that we have more groups than researchers, and not all of the researchers are based where the groups are located. So that led us to have to start to navigate some tricky issues early on. And one was that for each group, we needed to have both a lead researcher and then a support person, just given our geographic locations and teaching schedules. We couldn't say in advance exactly how those lead and support roles would play out with each group. So even before we entered the field, we had to think about how we would introduce ourselves to the groups, how we would navigate having somebody have a primary relationship with the group, but building enough rapport with another team member that team member could step in and as a support person at a few events when needed, or at some meetings, or do some of the interviews but not do the majority of the interviews, because our research had a participant observation component, as well as one-on-one interviews with group members. So our question, was like, how are we going to gain consent from people to participate in a project with a team when, willingness to engage over a 2-year period, because we had a 2-year period of working before the 3rd year of writing, would inevitably depend on building rapport with particular people and offering the group some amount of predictability, right? So we had some prolonged conversations among team members as well about how we were going to gain consent from activist group members to do the participant observation or to take part in this research at all. Because as I said, we have these individual interviews. That seemed fairly straightforward, right? With a one-on-one interview, you hand over the piece of paper, they read it, they sign it or they don't, and then you do the interview based on whether or not they've signed it or not. But we had thought that we would get the whole group's consent to do the project before approaching people one-on-one to do those individual interviews, and that before we did that, we would have the group sign our memorandum of understanding to indicate that they had consented to the project, to the research. So this was our grand plan going in, or as Karen would call it, our cunning scheme, our cunning plan to gain consent. But formal group consent to our MOUs was proving really difficult because groups didn't necessarily want to sign until they knew us. Or they simply didn't prioritize the MOU because they had a lot of really important work that they were doing, and our MOU was probably 12th or 15th on their list of priorities. So eventually we ended up just having to start to do the one-on-one interviews and to show up at group events to explain who we were and what we were doing, and kind of hope that that group consent, that formalized consent would follow. And as it turns out, it was those one-on-one interviews that did a big part of the work of generating the trust that enabled group consent to follow, at least with many of the groups that we were working with. We had some other issues I'll just talk about briefly. There was, we're attending events and we're taking notes. And so it's quite obvious that we're not just there because we support the cause, although we did. So, how are people who didn't know who we were or just floating in and out going to feel about us being there taking notes? What actions could we say on the part of different activist group members might indicate implicit consent while we were waiting for the MOUs to be signed? How do we read the room? What is it legitimate to say counts as implicit consent? And would that implied consent count, given our human ethics committee requirements that you get signed consent before you do your research with groups? We also talked about, given what we were doing, do we need to reintroduce ourselves at every single meeting we go to? Because if you've worked with activist groups, not everybody's able to show up at every meeting, so not everybody knows who you are and why you're there. We did some version of that because of the note-taking that we were doing, but then you start interfering in their time and taking up their time at their meetings where they're trying to do something really important by saying, hey, don't forget about our research. Our research is really important too. So there's that issue. Doing that works better when you're at a meeting than if you're showing up to a public event. If I show up to a protest rally and holding signs and all of that, how do I also say, by the way, I'm also here as a researcher and I'm observing everything and taking notes? So that also, then we worried a bit about, are some people in the group going to feel coerced into consenting to our presence once we had started doing that showing up over and over? Which also made us think about, what's at stake for them? Why would they bother letting us research the groups? Why would they bother letting us show up and take these notes? But a final component to that is that we also thought it was important for us to have, as we said in the article, skin in the game, which is not a great expression, but it's one I think we understand. We don't want to be a research team that just treats people as data, right? That's going to be antithetical to our values. It's also antithetical to the values embedded in, or at least evolving from the negotiations around the Treaty of Waitangi, right? The treaty that was signed between Maori and the Crown in 1860, and that we are still trying to negotiate and deal with. Yeah.
And to honour.
What's that?
And to honour, that we're still trying to honour.
Well, I was thinking more communal, bigger we, but we as a team are trying to honour that, yeah. So there's that question of, in a research context, if you do want to have, skin in the game, how do you engage with reciprocity without being captured by the group, right? How do we represent our institutions as well as ourselves and our values as individuals and as a team? And are we running the risk of coercing consent, which wouldn't really be consent then, by offering to support some groups who really need help with showing up at demonstrations or at volunteering at events or publicizing their events for them, right? So Karen, I think you were going to talk about some of the form signing.
Yes, so just to follow on from what Carisa's saying, we have worked with 6 groups and realised that they weren't prioritising our MOUs, and also that there was a sense of, why would we sign these forms, particularly as activists who were aware of, particularly that how, depending on how protest and occupation unfolded, that they then might have signed forms that the police could require under the Official Information Act. And so, so groups were interested in finding alternative ways to signed forms. So, for example, one of the groups, so all of the groups have consented to being named, as we name them in the article. And I'm aware that in the article we don't say which group chose which method of consent. So I'm just going to talk more generally. But so for example, one group who was really concerned about kind of police finding out about the forms, actually instead noted in their minutes that they were willing to be part of the research. But the other thing is that some of these groups were actually kind of included multiple subgroups, and so the just thinking about who could even sign on behalf of who was actually enormously complicated. And so for another group, signing a form with us as university employees, in some ways, there is that kind of perception amongst Māori that there's a kind of mistrust of formal written forms. Why would you sign something that you actually have got some sense of suspicion around, and is this the most meaningful way to consent? And that kind of alignment that happens with us being university employees as kind of being aligned with the Crown, the government, and the dishonoured promises of the Treaty of Waitangi that Carisa's talked about. So again, that group was caught up in a strategic change, and again, our MOU was well down the list. But what I think was really important about the MOU was that, unlike the usual consent forms that we produce for individual interviews, for example, we were clearly asking for what we were hoping or would like from our participants in terms of being at meetings and protests and other actions. But we also were really clear about what we wanted to offer. And that was actually kind of detailed in the MOU. So I thought that kind of notion of having a form that clearly articulates that was actually really important, even if it didn't get signed in the timeline that we had hoped for. So, and I think Carisa might say a little bit more about that, and so I'll pass it back to you to carry on, and I can chip in.
Cool, thanks, Karen. Yeah, I think part of what this raises is that the procedures and the expectations that are in place from the Human Ethics Committee do require, understandably, some formal written information about the research project being shared with groups or with participants before research begins, so that they have a sense of who you are and why you're there, and that the university has kind of responsibilities there as well. But we're talking about research that's collaborative, that's dynamic, that's occurring over an extended period of time. And so it is impossible really to say what the parameters of that research are eventually going to be, and how our reciprocal obligations with each other are going to be met over time. So this did come up in many different ways for us. We mentioned in the project the article, the Living Manifestos element, which was meant to be a way for groups to articulate their visions and strategies for change that hopefully was going to be useful for them, but also is going to be about us being able to see how they talk to each other about what their visions for a just world would be. And this became one of the sort of more interesting ways that we saw that our vision of what research would look like and their needs and aspirations about this were quite different. It's still evolving in practice. At any rate, given all this, we wrote the article and we're trying to think about, sort of other areas of life where consent is important, because we thought that maybe thinking through analogies would be a good way of homing in on what's significant or what is missing in any particular situation. And here are thinking about research relationships. So obviously there's something very specific and particular to a research relationship, but thinking through some of these other analogies enabled us to kind of prod conversations among ourselves, and we hope among others, about how do we ethically reimagine what consent processes can look like, given what actually does happen on the ground between researchers and groups that they're working with. So in the article, we talk about a few key things that we'd like to see be more explicitly acknowledged or available in the ethics review processes and procedures. Even as we acknowledge that, consent-based practices are critical to ethical research. So we're not contesting that at all. We're just thinking about how do we center in these discussions the acknowledgement that in participatory and ongoing qualitative work, we have to think about consent as an ongoing process and not a one-off or a tick box kind of thing. And that forms, as Karen said, are not necessarily reassuring for groups who since 1840, I think I said the wrong date earlier, but since 1840, signed a treaty that's still under contest. So we've also completed now what, if you would like, the data collection phase of our research. And so we're talking now about how do we honor the ongoing consent issues in the writing up of our research. How much of our writing do we share with participants before sending it out? How do we ethically honor the relationships we've built with group members when we want or need to write perhaps critically about certain practices or certain things that have been said in the research context? How do we acknowledge our commitments to groups given what they've shared with us? And many of them have shared a lot with us. So we talk a lot amongst the team, but also in ethnographic research discussions more generally in the social sciences about what it means to leave the field, right? But we also can't just walk away without replicating the very injustices that some communities are actively protesting, right? Researchers come in, they get their data, they leave, they write their journal articles, they get promoted, and nothing changes for the groups they've worked with. We don't want to be those researchers. On the other hand, you have many groups where you've got a high rate of turnover, and the people with whom we built relationships and had those consent processes are mostly gone at this point. So, how do we negotiate that? So from our perspective, we're kind of thinking about ways to expand ethics processes that could maybe account for things like consultation prior to research to gain a kind of broad community consensus on what research is or is not appropriate for that group, and where that consultation would take part before any forms are drawn up or signed, as being considered as part of that ethics process. Considering options for verbal consent. This is often preferred by some members, given that history of legal documents that we've talked about, but also because it can feel easier to renegotiate or withdraw later on than written consent. We think it's important to consider regular revisiting of what the researchers will do with and for the group, and whether the group is still happy to have researchers be there at their events. But also thinking about a period of time before the project formally starts, or if we mean by that signing of forms, for participant observation to take place, to kind of build that relationship that's necessary for people to feel comfortable offering their consent. And thinking about how that might be allowed to be part of the data, if you will, of the eventual writing up. If people retroactively say, this is feasible for us, understanding that for researchers, that is a risk, right? If you start, you spend 3 months, and then like, you know what, this is just not on, you've lost that time. But that's a risk that we might have to be willing to take. So we could think about how researchers and participants try each other out. And at the institutional level, this is probably going to mean ethical approval for research based on that consultation project without specifying a specific date or timeline by which these documents must be signed or this will not be approved. You know, and this is, we can think about this from our own project, our MOU practices, our Memorandum of Understanding practices, rather than the form itself, was that bridge between sort of institutional demands and the group processes, right? And so the MOU was important for prompting ongoing discussions about how we would reciprocate and what our reciprocal obligations were. And it was those conversations rather than the signing that really indicated a consent. And as Karen said, we didn't get formal signed forms from everybody. So for me, you know, these changes in how we think about consent really rely on thinking about consent as a kind of community value or norm about a set of behaviors and expectations for reciprocity and respect. It's about how we behave towards each other during, before, and after the time that we are so-called in the field as researchers. And then just one final point I want to raise before we open it up for discussion is that we didn't talk about in our article, but I think it's a question that does arise from the things that we're talking about today, is what do you do when you're researching with groups with whom you fundamentally disagree, right? In this particular project, we were working with groups who have visions that we are in alignment with, that we already basically, we agree with their values and their goals and their projects. But if we had worked with groups whose politics or actions were ones that we found profoundly harmful, how would we approach consent respectfully while maintaining our own personal boundaries, our own personal dignity, and also acknowledging the boundaries and the dignity of the people in those groups? I think that's one of the issues that we really have yet to fully work through, or to work through at all, really. But I think that the idea of ongoing negotiated consent is just as relevant for working with those groups as it is for working with groups with whom you already share a sort of fundamental value set. So yeah, so I think I'll go ahead and stop there. I think I've talked for quite a while now. Thank you again for inviting us today.
Thank you. I am remiss. I should have introduced Dr. Violetta Igneski at the beginning, but I will do so now. She is chair of the McMaster Research Ethics Board, and she's a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy here at McMaster. And her research examines issues of collective action, ethics, and social justice. And we're grateful that she is able to be here with us to talk a little bit about how the approach described in the research intersects with Tri-Council, our funding agencies, and McMaster ethics requirements.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed reading the paper, and it was really nice to see researchers being so thoughtful and considerate and thinking deeply about these questions of consent. So I really appreciated that. My thought was, this is going to be an experiment. I made up some notes, and I might put it on the share screen so you could look along, because a lot of my notes are just made out of excerpts that I pulled out of the TCPS2, so that we can sort of go over in our context how some of what you've discussed might be taken up. So, oh, the host disabled attendee screen sharing.
I thought I had fit.
Try now.
Okay. Oh, now I can do it. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to try to do this in, I was told 5 to 7 minutes. I promised I'll be under 10. I should say that the introductory remarks were super helpful and provided a lot of context and maybe answered some of the questions that I'm going to end with. But anyway, here goes. I'll just note what I took to be at issue in the paper. The first two are quotes taken right from the paper, that consent is expected from research participants before any relationship building has time to take place, and that ethics committees require informed consent before data collection. And just generally this minimal legalistic and formal conception of consent. And those are the things that are taken to be at issue. And what I want to do in the few minutes that I have today was consider how the proposed modifications, both to the concept of consent and also to the timing of consent, fit within the Canadian context of the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, which we just call the TCPS2. And then at the very end, I'll raise a couple of questions about the requirement for consent prior to data collection and also prior to building a relationship. So in terms of the concept of consent, you know, as a philosopher and an ethicist, I really love all the conceptual analysis and thinking about the concept of consent, and then looking into the TCPS2 to see how it understands the concept of consent. And, you know, very clearly it talks about free, informed, and ongoing consent. So maybe that could be aligned with what the researchers are talking about. I'd also love to hear a little bit about the end, a bit of the New Zealand context and the requirements there. So a few relevant excerpts from the TCPS2 are 3.3, which talks about consent being an ongoing process, and the application that consent encompasses a process that begins with the initial contact, so recruitment, and carries through to the end of the participant's involvement in the project. And then another relevant excerpt I thought was 3.5, where consent shall precede collection of or access to research data. Research, however, we're understanding research here, shall begin only after the participants or their authorized third parties have provided their consent. I should note that in discussing the concept of consent and how it's being understood here, we're talking about individual consent, and then we can think about how that might expand and apply to group consent. And then the application here in 3.5, in keeping with the principle of respect for persons, participants shall provide their consent prior to engaging in research. And below that, this article does not apply to conversations that researchers may have with prospective participants as part of the development of the design of their research. These preliminary conversations, which may include negotiations concerning the terms on which a researcher may engage with a particular community or group, do not in themselves constitute research and therefore do not require consent. I should also note to Carisa and Karen that I can send you my notes after this, email them to you. That would be useful. So, okay, that was the first section, talking a little bit about the concept of consent in TCPS2, and then I want to talk a little bit about the consent requirement and the timing according to the TCPS2, and that it does make room for some alterations and exceptions. So, you know, typically it's required, but if the aims of the research can be achieved with a design that allows for full or fuller prior disclosure, that design must be adopted. But that there are exceptions to the requirement to seek prior consent. And the exception here, an REB may allow an exception to the requirement that researchers seek consent from participants prior to the collection of data. Researchers must demonstrate that this alteration to consent requirements is necessary to address the research question, and that the lack of prior consent will not have an adverse impact on the welfare of participants. They must also demonstrate that the benefits of the research, whether direct, indirect, or societal, justifies any risks associated with no prior consent. So the other point that might be relevant here is it seems pretty clear in the TCPS2 that relationship building can begin prior to ethics review. In 10.1, researchers shall submit their research proposals, including proposals for pilot studies, for REB review and approval. Subject to the exceptions in Article 10.5, REB review is not required for the initial exploratory phase, often involving contact with individuals or communities intended to discuss the feasibility of the research, establish research partnerships, or the design of the research proposal. I wanted to say a little bit about group consent and community engagement, because this is directly addressed in TCPS 2. The biggest section of this is section 9, where it deals with Indigenous communities, but that's then also extended to include other communities. And the upshot here is that relationship building can, and in some research contexts should, in fact, take place prior to formal consent, and often even prior to ethics review. And so we have section 9.1 noting the requirement of community engagement in Indigenous research. 9.2, the nature and extent of community engagement, noting that it shall be determined jointly by the researcher and the relevant community, and shall be appropriate to community characteristics and the nature of the research. I think also relevant and important is the application there in 9.2. In order for the REBs to consider whether the form of community engagement chosen by the researcher is appropriate, they will require evidence in the form of one or more of the following. A preliminary or formal research agreement between the researcher and the responsible body at the research site. So certainly that's one of the options, but then there are these other options as well that are much more informal. You have B, a written decision or documentation of an oral decision made in a group setting to approve the proposed research or to decline further participation. And C, a written summary of advice received from culturally informed advisory group or ad hoc committee. So I think that seems to fit in line with what happened with your project, at least when dealing with one of the communities. And then I note section 211 here that just shows that just notes that these principles also apply not just with Indigenous communities, but more broadly with other communities. Section 4, here I just wanted to say a little bit about, I thought it was fantastic to think about and talk about this broader understanding of consent and this idea that consent requires a relationship. So I really appreciated the opportunity to think about that a little bit more. This idea of consent being non-linear and dynamic. What I was interested in, sort of the interplay and how researchers and REBs need to communicate and think about these different kinds of consent and when they're appropriate. So you had formal consent, informal consent, and tacit consent. And it seems like they're appropriate in different kinds of contexts. So with your interviews with individuals, you had them sign formal consent forms. You had these developed MOUs, and that would be context dependent. Certainly according to TCPS 2, these formal agreements would not be required. And then you had the participant observation component, and section 10.3 in the TCPS 2 allows for waiving of individual consent with participant observation. But again, it would be interesting to know what would be involved in the participant observation. You talked about taking notes. That might be, if you're quoting particular individuals, that would require possibly a different level of consent targeted toward the individuals. Whereas if you were just sitting there and listening, that would be different. It would be probably sufficient to, write a little note on the board or mention it or pass out a card or something like that. We've had a lot of researchers go that route. I like the discussion of sort of this legalistic model, the tick box just to minimize risk versus this lived model of mutual obligation of respect, the individual and group consent both being important. And I liked how you problematized the idea of, who makes the group, who has to be present, and there are power dynamics in the group. So who do we allow to make the decision? So all those are that's a minefield of problems that are interesting to think about. And of course, this idea that consent ought to be ongoing over time. And I liked also this idea that you had that consent is negotiated agreement, and that being a more ethical approach. And I'm not sure, one of the things that I thought about as I read your paper was, is this thinking about consent as a negotiated agreement, is it really something that contrasts with and butts up against current guidelines, or is it the way that it's taken up by and formalized and applied by ethics committees? And that might be something that is worth thinking about negotiating. Okay, because I'm in full screen, I don't know how much time I have, but I'm just going to end with a couple of questions, if you don't mind. And these are my questions. Some of them I think you've talked about. is consent required from individuals and from the group to pursue relationship building? I think I took from you that it was some version of it. But then I wanted to know is, do you consider relationship building distinct from data collection, or is it a part of data collection? So, you talked about attending meetings and participant observation. So it seems like they have dual functions, that they are relationship building and also data collection. And my second question, can you say a little bit more, though you did actually this part, about the way consent was obtained and documented? You had noted that researchers checked if it was appropriate to take notes, and that groups consented informally to observation and gave tacit consent for research relationships to begin. And so it seemed that, there was a process of consent there. And so that perhaps the disagreement isn't really about the permissibility of data collection prior to obtaining consent, but rather how to understand consent and the process of obtaining it. And I end by thanking Nick for chatting with me about the paper, and thanks to the authors for this fantastic paper.
Kia ora, thank you for that, yeah. Michelle, you're still on mute.
Of course I am. I was going to ask if you want to kind of respond to the prompts that Violetta offered, and then we can take additional questions from other participants.
Karen, did you want to start?
Thank you, Violetta. I mean, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, but fantastic to have your engagement, and also to see the inner workings of ethics documents in the Canadian context, and to see how there is a certain amount of flexibility in your documents that is possibly available in ours as well. This is inspiring me to go back to our ethics committee to talk about this in more depth as well, actually. So thank you. And one of the questions I think is really valuable in terms of what you've asked is, the relationship building data collection and how, I think you're right that we were engaging in them as in that dual sense, because they were, they were building the relationships, but also they were absolutely really important moments for data collection, because they were at various kind of protests, campaigns, meetings. They were serving that dual function, and we were really aware of the expectation that we gain kind of some kind of formal consent. That was the expectation, particularly like we really familiar with the individual consent process, but it was actually quite challenging, especially because we would often go to meetings over time, building those relationships and waiting patiently for our MOU to be signed, and realising that it just kept dropping off the radar of many of our groups. And so we were, collecting, we saw those as prime opportunities for collecting data as well as building relationships. And but always checking, particularly at the small scale. The meetings were more straightforward for us to always ask. But I'm aware that when I was at, for example, Protect Ihu Mātau, which they were physically occupying the land. They had land reclamation gatherings of huge numbers. And, I'm there as a researcher that's also going around collecting donations or koha for the campaign. People wouldn't have known at all that I was there in my research capacity, apart from those who I'd initially approached. So, that's what kind of prompted us to write the paper, because we realised that that was really a complicated situation. And I don't know whether Carisa wants to say anything else, but I'd be interested in anyone else who works with groups, and particularly around political action, you know, how do you manage this? Because I don't think we've come to any kind of answer.
And every group was different.
That's right.
You know, so a process for one group was completely different from a process with each of the other groups. So we had one group or a few groups where there were sort of key people, and those were the key people we had a relationship with. And then there are lots of sort of floating in and out. We had people who had there had been an indication that everybody was on board with the research, but then we would try to schedule one-on-one interviews because everybody was on board, and then they wouldn't show up, which kind of indicates that they didn't actually consent, but maybe felt a bit coerced or pressured by other group members or peer pressure to consent. So how do we go back and take their observations out of the other aspects of the data collection where they didn't raise an objection to us being there in a group setting? You know, even the process, with one group, it was after like the third or fourth time we'd asked about the MOU, not to pressure, but, you know, just want to make sure you're okay. And is there anything you need from us and all that? It's like, oh, that's fine. But that was the consent of the extent of the consent process, right? Like, oh, don't worry about it. I was worried about it. But, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, something that I want to kind of expand on a little bit more, which is what we did to reciprocate, because I think we haven't had a chance to say that. I know it's not addressing your questions, Violetta, but one of the things that you know, our groups did ask us to so there was one of our colleagues did a large summary of data for a group. They had collected their own data but needed help with summarising it, so that was something that she did. Another team member maintained the timeline for Protect Ihu Mātau because they had so much happening, and we were able to kind of offer assistance. And then there was kind of more mundane things like holding a protest sign and bringing food to meetings. We kind of indicate some of that in the paper. But I really liked the fact that we specified what we were going to give back, and found that a really refreshing kind of approach that I could see has the potential to be adapted to the individual consent process. So that's something that I thought had potential to be expanded on as well. But I'll pass it to you, Carisa, because you might like to add your thoughts on Violetta's questions.
Well, there were a couple of questions that really stuck out for me as really important ones to think about. And Karen, you addressed one of them. The other one was, Violetta, when you asked, is what we're talking about actually different from the guidelines as they currently exist, or is it different from the way the guidelines are being implemented by ethics review committees? And I think that's an important question, because we also, I at least often think about, I know what they're going to ask and require of me. So I usually just go to talk to the person or people on the committees rather than reading through all of the many, many, many pages of guidelines to find out what do I need to do for certain, because all of these guidelines are interpreted by people who have to implement them. And so maybe the most important question here is not about rewriting our consent processes more broadly, but about having ongoing conversations with our ethics review committees about the ways in which we as human beings understand what consent means. And I think they're all in place for really good reasons. And I know that there are, good concerns that we have about, research that could go quite badly if you don't have certain formal agreements that we can all point to and say, this is what we agreed to. But we need to weigh in individual cases that those might work differently. And so I don't know that I have an answer to that, except that I think that the question itself is a good way of prompting that conversation or prompting that thinking, because it is true that we look to the formal guidelines, but those formal guidelines have to be enforced by people. And those on the committee are doing their best to look at research in lots of fields that may not be their own And those researchers are going out in the field and saying, oh shoot, I signed this form that said I'm going to do this, but here I am confronted with this situation right on the ground that means something else. What do I do? Do I call up? Hold that thought at this protest. I'm going to make a phone call to my ethics review committee. So I guess I would be interested in hearing what people think about that a bit more. Throwing Violetta's question back to others.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I suspect that the review boards get a lot of different strategies used by researchers. Some who never reach out and check with a person about what they're planning to do and try to just read the document and then end up with a wildly kind of off-base interpretation. And others that have those conversations. I know that I often find myself having questions with graduate students that they make certain assumptions about because they've taken and had kind of the week on ethics in their graduate seminar, and they had to read our policy statement, but then they kind of assume that implies certain things, like that they couldn't ever do virtual interviews. That would not ever be allowed by ethics somehow, which clearly it's possible. I think there might be other questions, but I wanted to ask one, if I could, about this notion that there are different people who are seen as kind of the people that should be giving consent versus other members of the group. And so I understand, for instance, in the Canadian context, it's not uncommon for researchers that are working with Indigenous communities to kind of seek official approval through, say, a First Nations ethics board in a particular community. But that kind of official process is not the same as the elders of the community, who some members of the community might think are more legitimate and have a more legitimate voice in deciding what is best for a community. So I'm wondering if those same types of tensions exist in the New Zealand context. And I'm also wondering how researchers at McMaster, for instance, how they have handled, or what strategies they have used to kind of navigate this terrain where, if you are thinking of consent as checking off certain boxes, you would go to a particular set of people, but other members of the community might actually think there are other folks that should have been consulted. And, how does the ethics board view those things? What's the most ethical strategy going forward? So I guess it's kind of a question for everyone, and I think Allison has one after that as well.
So I mean, shall I answer that in relation to our experience? So particularly, like, we worked with several groups who had, I suppose, were led by Indigenous women, actually, and it was really interesting. For example, one of those groups, Protect Ihu Mātau, they actually had both, led by an Indigenous group of cousins, actually, and it was really clearly a group that was Māori or Indigenous led, and there was a really, as part of that, there was a group that were primarily Pākehā or white and older, really clear about their role as supporting that, as one of the cousins in the interviews said, nothing went ahead unless it had the stamp of the Indigenous cousins or Māori cousins. So that was the kind of key model. But it's really interesting, like, it raises questions: who speaks on behalf of who is willing to sign, and and again, if you have mistrust of formal processes. So that was quite a dilemma as to, you know, like I saw the cousins as who I was seeking permission from, but they, you know, also some of them directed me to the Pākehā group in terms of some of those more formal discussions. So it was really interesting to negotiate and to realise that there was kind of different ways that consent was being indicated. Like, you know, I took the consent to be indicated by the invitation for me to be at the reclamation, you know, reclamation of the land, you know, and making sure that I was there was actually really important. So I read consent in a number of different kind of ways and saw myself as always checking in with every subgroup that I interacted with. And often just ended up referring to myself as I'm the researcher, and and realising that that, you know, that's going to keep, you know, something that I need to keep doing over time, because I you know, turn up but then, you know, return to Dunedin. I don't live in Auckland, so again, just keeping the relationships warm is something that I need to continue to work on. So that's just a little bit of an insight there. Carisa, do you want to add anything?
I would say that I think, and Karen, you have more experience with this than I do, but my understanding around working with Indigenous communities in Aotearoa is that there is an expectation of consultation before research begins, and that consultation is taken quite seriously. It's not just a tick box, but it is taken seriously. But one thing that is interesting, because before this project, this would come up in work that I have done more in terms of working with people working in the sex work community, right? And so part of consultation is about consultation with vulnerable communities, right? So it's a broader sort of norm. Again, a norm about how research is conducted and how you relate with people. And so there's this really great article written by a researcher here at, I think she's at Waikato, Carol Harrington, who's talked about why feminist and sex worker interactions and research and discussions have evolved so differently here than in other places. And and she ties it back to this kind of norm of consultation, right? Not just a process, but a norm that sets a norm for relationships. And so that I think we do have this rooted in the kind of relationships with vulnerable communities that start with Indigenous Crown relations, but then move beyond that to thinking more broadly about who in the community is vulnerable and what does that mean in working with them and who gets to speak for whom. And so, you know, who and with whom are you building this relationship? So Karen had started this relationship with Protectio Matau, and then I would show up at some points, and she would introduce me, and I met people, and then Karen would go back to Dunedin, and I would continue to go to events, and I would get a lot of questions like, and who are you again? Which research group are you working with? You know, because in a small country, I think some groups feel very over-researched as well, which is another issue we have to keep in mind. So I'm not sure how tight my relationship was with all members in that sense, but yeah, anyway, I think you said Allison was going to ask a question.
Yes. So I'm very interested in this messy middle of reciprocity and deep engagement with a group, and also working towards being able to do independent analysis, and all the tensions that go into the beauty and the significance of reciprocity. And I know I struggle with this constantly in my research, and I find it a really difficult balance to figure out how to establish myself both as an ally and as a critical observer. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about holding that balance.
That's a great question, and I
one
think
we've spent hours talking about.
Right.
Yeah. And right in amongst at the moment, actually, because I think, because we're heading into the writing more intensively, and I think we're going to try and hold those kind of roles of ally and critical friend. But I agree, like already when I've done like that, my writing, and then gone back to thinking about how will it be for the people I've interviewed to read this, because they're part of who we're writing for. And so, I think this deserves another paper, and a fantastic point, Alison, like who guides you? who do you read and look to for guidance in that area?
For me, a lot of my background in thinking about that has come out of having done a lot of private consulting. And that in the private consulting world, you are hired and they actually pay you to be a critical friend. And so I tended to bring that same approach into my research and basically establish from the beginning that that's my job and it's out of allyship.
And I think part of it is, as Karen said, as we're thinking about, you had asked about reciprocity and deep engagement, but also, as that critical friend, we've kept in mind, we talk a lot about how the main group that we want to write for are the participants, actually. We want to they've shared all of this with us. So part of our deep engagement and reciprocity is not just producing articles that are hid behind paywalls, but things that might be useful to the community, or ways of hopefully connecting them with each other in some way, or serving as a kind of opportunity for more reflection, but where they also feel like we have been respectful in our engagements with them, and in the way that we sort of bring our own lens to what they've told us. That's where I think it's really useful that we also are a group, right? Because among the research team, we have different experiences, different disciplinary backgrounds, and often are critical friends with each other. I think that's fair to say, Karen, is that?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, and what we aim for, actually. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think we've been together now an hour, and I enjoyed the conversation, and I'm grateful to everyone who took time out of your busy schedules at various different times of day in different time zones to engage in this discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for the invitation. It's really wonderful to get a chance to see your group and to talk with you all, and really appreciate your feedback and ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you from me too. I really valued this, so thanks very much. And would have loved to have talked longer.